What is wrong with the weapons and armor of the elite Uruk-Hai from the Lord of the Rings film trilogy? Why would some elements of the Isengard army's equipment be not just ineffective in real conditions, but actually dangerous for the warriors themselves? I will answer these questions in this video. You are watching the MiliTime Fiction channel. Let's begin. Before analyzing the equipment of the Uruk-Hai, it is important to establish two key points. First, the orcs in Peter Jackson's adaptation are a mass-produced industrial product and expendable material for the forces of darkness. This is especially evident in the case of the Uruk-Hai. They are almost completely devoid of individuality and are not even born naturally like normal biological species. Uruks emerge from mud inside semi-transparent cocoons as a result of Saruman's magical experiments. The Uruk-Hai are a resilient biological machine, created quickly and in large numbers. Therefore, the use of simplified and far from perfect weapons and armor looks justified. When manpower is an easily replaceable resource, there is no need to spend time and materials on high-quality individualized equipment. Second, Saruman was creating his army to fight a very specific and highly specialized enemy, the Riders of the Kingdom of Rohan. The Uruk-Hai were purely infantry, which means their weapons and armor had to be optimized specifically to counter cavalry. The destruction of Rohan's army was Saruman's key strategic objective. According to the plan of the dark side, Sauron was to capture Minas Tirith, while Rohan was not supposed to come to Gondor's aid. In the event of success, Mordor would effectively win the war. However, everything turns out exactly the opposite, and the plan of Sauron and Saruman collapses. For the topic of this video, it is important to understand that with such high stakes, Saruman could afford to invest significant resources into creating specialized equipment designed essentially for a single decisive campaign. Keep these two ideas in mind throughout the analysis. Uruk-Hai helmets. Let's start with the helmets. All of them look roughly assembled from several elements. The central designs are clearly inspired by the historical kettle hat, widespread in Europe from the 13th to the 15th centuries. There were variants of kettle hats with elongated brims that partially covered the face, as well as versions with gorgets and bevers protecting the lower face and neck. We can see similar elements in Uruk-Hai helmets, however their facial visor is too short and provides weak protection. One of the models also features a riveted neck guard similar to the lobster tail seen on Salit helmets. This is a useful and historically justified element. However, such helmets were most often worn by crossbowmen, for whom the primary threat came from the front rather than from above or behind. On the other hand, crossbowmen did indeed need a wide field of view and lighter helmets without excessive protection. The two outer helmets used by swordsmen are equipped with massive metal crests. In reality, such an element would be dangerous for the wearer. It increases the weight of the helmet and creates an additional lever. A blow to the crest could result in serious cervical spine injuries. The crest also provides something to grab onto, making the situation even more dangerous. Such strange protruding elements on armor are often found in fantasy design. The likely inspiration was the plume of Roman centurions. However, in reality, plumes were detachable, made of horsehair, and weighed almost nothing. In addition, they were worn only by commanders for visual identification on the battlefield. Historical combat helmets with metal crests did exist. For example, Thracian and Phrygian helmets from antiquity, as well as the medieval Spanish Mauryan. However, their crests ran along the length of the head rather than across it, as on the orc helmets. This shape helped deflect blows. A similar principle applied to spheroconical helmets, such as the Turkish shishak. If the crest is removed, the Uruk-Hai helmet becomes a crude but fairly reliable form of head protection. The eye slits provide acceptable visibility, while the open nose and mouth area makes breathing easier during intense combat. Yes, this area is vulnerable to thrusting attacks, but such compromises are typical of many historical helmets. In addition, the presence of Ibavor partially compensates for this weakness. By tilting the head forward, the wearer can hide the face behind the bavor as if behind a shield. An interesting feature is the protruding protection of the lower jaw and upper neck on one of the helmets. In real history, such elements were usually made close-fitting in order to avoid creating leverage points. Examples include the Corinthian helmet or medieval Salit barbutes. In the case of the Uruk-Hai, however, the design is clearly intended to counter downward strikes. The opponent's weapon is meant to slide off the protruding plates, losing energy. Within the given tactical context, this design makes sense, since the orc's main enemy is mounted cavalry. Uruk-Hai armor body protection consists of a mail shirt and a plate breastplate, while the back remains without plate protection. Beneath the mail male, there must be padded clothing such as a gambeson. Otherwise, constant friction from the metal rings would turn the skin into an open wound. Such a configuration is historically plausible. For example, some 16th century landsknechts, unable to afford a full cuirass, wore only a breastplate, leaving the back unprotected. This was based on the assumption that most blows come from the frontal direction. Considering that the Uruk-Hai are expendable resources, such a half-measure cuirass looks like a logical compromise. It increases average survivability while being made of several overlapping plates rather than a single solid piece, which significantly simplifies production. The arms are usually protected by simple plate vambraces. The only modification, short spikes near the wrist, is practically useless. They are too small to effectively stab or parry attacks. More interesting is the combined gauntlet shield design. Similar constructions existed historically, such as the lantern shield or trench rondash. Although the orc version differs significantly from historical examples, it allows both defense and striking with a spiked fist, which functions like a mace. The shoulder pauldrons of the Uruk-Hai are quite well designed and even feature ridges to protect the neck. However, protection of the thighs is completely absent. They are entirely exposed. At the same time, the greaves are well protected. This indicates strict optimization. Thigh strikes can be relatively effectively blocked with the standard orc shield, whereas the lower legs cannot be protected with a shield in combat due to its limited size. Therefore, it makes sense to cover the lower legs with plate armor. By the way, what can we say about the orc shield's shield? The Uruk-Hai shield is a large, solid forged metal plate with a vertical stiffening rib and a reinforced upper edge. In the upper right corner, there is a notch reminiscent of elements found on the so-called Dipolon shield. The historicity of the Dipolon shield is still debated as no archaeological finds have been discovered. If such notches did exist, they were most likely used for placing a spear while fighting in formation. However, the Uruk-Hai shield more closely resembles a pavis. This is indicated by the pronounced spikes at the bottom, which could be used to brace the shield against the ground. Pavises were often used as stationary cover for crossbowmen. It is highly likely that the notch in the Uruk shield was intended specifically for crossbow use, to support the stock and allow convenient aiming from behind cover. The reinforced upper edge also increases the shield's durability under impact and creates a ricochet effect when struck by enemy arrows. The main problem with such a shield is its weight. In reality, it would almost certainly weigh over 10 kilograms, depending on the thickness of the metal. The ease with which orcs wielded in the film can be explained either by their significantly greater physical strength or by the existence of a lightweight fantasy metal. Next, let's move on to orc weapons. Uruk sword. The one-handed swords of the Uruk-Hai exist in two main variants. The first is a blade without a guard with a poorly defined point, though still sufficient for thrusting. Based on the blade shape and mass distribution, it is clear that this weapon is primarily oriented toward cutting blows. In fact, it is not a classical sword, but something between a machete, an axe, and a short sword. The closest historical analog is the Indonesian golok, a wide knife used as a tool and occasionally as a weapon of self-defense. However, the golok was not designed to fight well-armored opponents. The orcs, however, fight humans, dwarves, and elves, whose armor corresponds to the level of the developed Middle Ages. Against such protection-thrusting swords or blunt force weapons such as warhammers are far more effective. If we look at Oakeshot's typology of swords from the 14th to the 16th centuries, it becomes clear that blades gradually became narrower and sharper. This was due to the spread of plate armor, against which cutting attacks lost effectiveness. Thrusting became increasingly important. The orcs find themselves in similar conditions, yet the forces of darkness somehow ignore this reality. However, there is a logical explanation. Most Uruk-Hai exist for a very short time and do not possess advanced fencing training. Their strength lies in numbers. A thrusting attack requires high precision, distance control, coordination, and timing. A cutting blow is much easier to learn. It is intuitive, less demanding in terms of accuracy, and allows greater tolerance in distance. For poorly trained mass infantry, such a weapon is a reasonable choice. The second type of Uruk sword features a curved perpendicular spike resembling a bec de corbin. Such a weapon is capable of effectively defeating mail armor and striking into the joints of armor. If we closely examine the army of Rohan, we see that most warriors wear mail shirts. Against such protection, the orc's hooked spike is a very effective weapon. In addition, the hook can be used to pull riders off their horses. However, against heavy plate armor, such a spike would be fragile and limited in penetration depth. A classical sword provides a much broader range of vulnerable targets. Nevertheless, against the army of Rohan, where most warriors wear mail, this weapon proves to be quite effective. Bow and crossbow. The widespread use of crossbows indirectly confirms the low level of individual combat training among the Uruk-Hai. A crossbow is significantly easier to master than a longbow. However, crossbows also offer serious tactical advantages. Orcs frequently conduct sieges where combat takes place under constant fire from walls. A crossbow allows the user to cock the string behind cover, quickly step out, shoot, and retreat again. It is compact and convenient in narrow fortress passages. Although a crossbow is inferior to a bow in rate of fire, its armor-piercing capability makes it an extremely dangerous weapon against most types of armor. For a mass army of orcs, this is a rational choice. Conclusion: Saruman equipped the Uruk-Hai with maximum resource optimization for specific tasks. Yes, their equipment is crude and far from perfect, but it is effective within the framework of the objective set. In real history, such weapons and armor would be unlikely to see widespread use. People who could afford high-quality armor lived longer, had long training cycles, and came from a military aristocracy with sufficient resources for proper equipment. However, within the logic of the film, the equipment of the Uruk-Hai makes sense. That's all for today. Share your thoughts and ideas in the comments. You are watching the MiliTime Fiction channel. Good luck and see you next time!